Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Tony Fairfax. Tony is a demographic consultant and engineer with 20 years' experience providing demographic mapping and expert redistricting services. His clientele include numerous nonprofit and public sector groups. The book we're going to talk about is very interesting if you're interested in presidential elections at all. The Presidential Trend, a remarkable voting predictability of the office of president, includes 2016 election analysis. Tony, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
This is an interesting book, and I guess you get credit for a new theory called trend theory. Is that accurate?
It's something I've coined, I guess, presidential trend theory.
Mm-hmm. Now, before I go too far, since it says you're consulting on redistricting, you haven't been helping with all the gerrymandering going on in the country, have you?
No, I do fair redistricting. I make sure that the lines and the plans are fair and represent the population in a particular jurisdiction.
Super. Well, let's talk about representative of the population, because you have a book here that has done a very thorough job of examining election patterns. It especially shows something distinct about the presidential elections between 72 and 2000, excluding one outlier election, regarding the Democratic pattern in particular being fairly linear and continuing to increase year after year. And that starts with an understanding that the electorate got fractured between 68 and 72.
Right. As you said, that what I'm putting forth in the book is a theory that the electorate fractured. What occurred was, as you said before, there was this linear straight line trend. If you plot this on a graph of the popular vote for the Democratic candidate from 72 to 2000, there's a straight line you will see, excluding 1976. During the same period of time, the Republican and independent candidates' votes, they fluctuate like they should fluctuate. When you think about it, you have every election has different issues come up. They have different candidates and opponents. They have different U.S. and global conditions, economic conditions. And most of all, they have different voter turnout. So even though from election to election there were different voter turnout percentages, this Democratic popular vote increased in a straight line. And so I put forth a political theory that back in started in 68, ended in 72, that the electorate was fractured into two pieces. And if you can imagine two electorate, and of course, the electorate is not a physical thing. It's not, but this is just the analogy to understand what's going on. You had two sides, and one side I call the Democratic electorate, and the other side I call the non-Democratic electorate. You have Democrats basically in the Democratic electorate and everyone else in the non-Democratic electorate, and that's why I call it the non-Democratic electorate. But just like you would have a population trend of basically one group of people increasing year after year, and you get a linear trend, that's the reason why you get a linear trend from 72 to 2000. Excluding 1976, you have one group of voters, essentially the Democratic voters in this Democratic electorate, and that's the reason why you get this increase, this linear trend. Mm-hmm. On the other side, you get another phenomenon that I talk about in the book. It corroborates the theory of the fracturing.
You want to talk about the mirroring at this point? Is that
right?
Okay.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this linear trend on one side, of essentially one type of voters, the Democratic voters increasing, and you have new voters basically added, just like you would have new population in a population trend. On the other side, though, if it's truly fractured, you only have two different types of voters in that. You have Republican and independents. You don't have the Democratic candidate fighting for those votes. If you have a situation where you only have two voters fighting for the same voters, you actually get this pull back and forth, and you end up getting a mirror effect. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you had, let's say, a classroom, and you and I were running for class president, and 60 people in the class, you would get 50 people, I would get 10. We did the election again, you get 40, I get 20. And if we plotted that, we would have a mirror image of each other's votes. And that shows that only two people are running. If a third person was running, we wouldn't get a mirror effect, because that third entity will be pulling away from one of the others. So again, if you look at the graph on the back of the book, you can see there's a mirror effect for the for the Republican and independent candidates' votes, while the Democratic popular vote is increasing with no effect in a straight line.
Now, one of the things on that analysis, I want to make sure our listeners are clear. It is, in fact, when one goes up, the other goes down. But you lump the independents together as one group, right, in some of those elections, yeah. But
all of it, correct.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's another linear trend in that the voting age population continues to go up from 72 to 2000. I suppose that continues throughout time, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm. And that's a normal trend.
Sure.
Exactly. The voting age population is a normal trend. Additional people become 18 year after year, unless it's some anomaly like the baby boomer, where you have an exceptionally large group of people being born. And then they turn 18, then you may see a bump in the voting age population.
Well, let's talk about one bump. Let's talk about that outlier election 76. What's the explanation for it not fitting the pattern of all the others, do you think?
Right. If you think about it, you think what occurred right before that particular election in 1976. And there's one thing that stands out, and that's the resignation of a U.S. president. We never had that before in the history of our country. And so what that did was that those individuals that actually fractured, and actually it was a group of people that sort of broke away from the Democratic Party, really, and moved into what I call the non-democratic electorate. Those individuals actually moved back for one election. They shifted back for one election and voted for Jimmy Carter. And then back in 1980, they shifted back away from the Democratic candidate and back into what I call the non-democratic electorate. So the Watergate, I think, is that critical piece that made it an anomaly. I think it left a bad taste in people's mouths, and for that one election, they shifted over.
Mm-hmm. And let's, while we're talking about the hiccups that created this shift, let's look at 68 to 72 when this fracturing occurred. There was a lot of turmoil going on in the country at that time for a lot of different reasons, right?
Right, exactly. During that period of time, they call it, or some people call it, the turbulent 60s. There was so much going on there. There was recreational drug use sort of rising. There was the women's liberation movement. There was a sexual revolution going on at that time. You had the war in Vietnam, which is just unsettling to everybody, regardless of which side you were on. And then you had, probably for the first time in history, you had these major assassinations of major figures, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and you had civil rights leaders, for example, like, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, all these prominent people that you actually read about and see on TV, they were assassinated. And so there was this unsettling. And then you had, I think, these three civil rights acts occurring in a short period of time. And I think part of the thing that happened was I think you had a group of population that was dissatisfied with that and actually shifted away from the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And what they did was they voted for George Wallace in 1968. And they never came back. They came back rather for that one election, that anomaly in 1976, but essentially they never came back. They were disenchanted with all of these things going on, and including the Civil Rights Act, and broke away. And that's what caused this fracturing to actually occur.
Mm-hmm. Now, you even mentioned a quote by Lyndon Johnson. He'd signed some of the civil rights legislation, of course, the Civil Rights Act of '64, but another law in '68 that he signed, he basically said, I think we're signing away the South from the Democratic Party.
Exactly, the Fair Housing Act, mm-hmm. Yes. In essence, people forget about the Fair Housing Act. You have the Civil Rights Act, 1964, the Voting Rights Act, 1965, and the Fair Housing Act was 68. And I think, Lyndon Johnson said, again, like you said, I think he actually lost. The Democratic Party essentially will lose the South for a generation. And actually it ended up being, I think, more than a generation. Mm-hmm. the critical piece of that is, I think, one thing I think people realized was, okay, they just were adamantly opposed to individuals who, minority individuals, African Americans, even Latino individuals, actually moving into their neighborhoods. That was sort of the last straw. I mean, civil rights, voting rights, but then the Fair Housing Act actually was somewhat of the last straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. And I think that's what gave rise to George Wallace's run, essentially. And so he garnered a considerable amount of votes in that particular election. I believe about 13% of the vote, 13.5% of the vote, which was considerable, and about almost 10 million voters at that particular time.
And that was huge in terms of the representation of independent electorate. He and I guess later the Texas Ross Perot
exactly
took an awful lot of independent votes in what is usually a two-party system.
Exactly.
Now, there was a fracture before that in 48 that we probably ought to mention because it involves a guy who lived to be almost 200, Strom Thurmond.
Right. He did live a long time. I back in 48 turned out to be another critical piece to this. I began to, as I got into this, I began to flesh out some other anomalies, some other voting patterns, if you will. And it seems as though the first or beginning fracturing occurred in 1948, and it occurred for the most part because of Harry Truman signing these two executive orders. I think it was 1999-80 and 99-81, and this was the 99-80 was the banning of segregation in the armed services. And it was very controversial. Wouldn't be controversial now, but back then it was extremely controversial. And the second one was guaranteed fair employment practices in the civil service. And that was also controversial, actually, making sure that employment was fair and practical for all races. And so those two essentially executive orders really sparked the Dixiecrats. And so the Dixiecrats sprung up, and they had their individuals that they selected, who was a young senator from South Carolina called Strom Thurmond. And, he didn't seem like he did that well, but in that period of time, he did well. He got about 2%, I believe, a little over 2.5% almost, and 1 million votes. But he won several states, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina. So he won those southern states. And so that was, in my estimation, the beginning, sort of the beginning sort of notch. It didn't fracture the electorate really, but it was a notch that was later ready to be fractured in 68.
Now, it's interesting that the race issue it prevails there. I mean, Truman not only signed those orders, but he was the first president to address the NAACP, and he committed himself in the federal government to civil rights and freedom of black Americans. And then 68 is a turbulent time for race rights again. And in fact, when Wallace got elected, he declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Exactly.
And people remember that. People remember that. Most people also sort of forget that, when Martin Luther King made his great speech, in Washington, D.C., he only pointed to one person, and, that was George Wallace. In his speech, where he begins to say down in Alabama,
right?
And then he starts with racist, and it's racist governor, dripping, with the words of imposition and the nullification. The governor was George Wallace. He was the only person that he pointed out in that famous speech, and so that gives you sort of an idea of the polarization, I think, that was going on with George Wallace at the particular time, and his followers at that particular time, and thus it manifests itself in 68.
And so we have that trend 72 to 2000, but when you went back to the 48, the first chance for a fractured electorate, when something got broken off, something got cracked. Then you looked at a longer term trend between 48 and what was it? Was it
92? 40, 68, and 92.
Okay, and you see a linear trend again.
Right, right. You know, one of the things that I came across, if you will, is I noticed it in 92, and that mirror effect, that between the Republican and independent candidates' votes, for some reason wasn't as proportional in 92 as it was with the other elections, and I wondered why. It almost seems like in 92, it almost seems like George Herbert Walker Bush should have dipped down further, and it was as if he reached a sort of valley or a core that he could not go below. And I thought, could this be the core, of the Republican Party? Because I think the core of the Democratic electorate was essentially the vote for the Democratic candidate from 72 to 2000. That's what happened. When this fracture occurred, it only left a core there. Well, I thought, could it be the core in 92? And so I began to think, let me look at other elections. And so I came to the conclusion that when you have these major independent candidates essentially soaking up all of the rest of the votes, what you do is you reveal the cores of the party. So it revealed the core of the Democratic Party and the core of the Republican Party, and those actually remaining folks were soaked up by the independent votes. And to prove that, you can draw a straight line from 1948 to 62 and 92. And it's not only straight for the Democratic candidate, the Republican candidate, it's also straight for the independent candidates. And so, having that anomaly there is just amazing, that all three of them align in a straight line for each of those different political entities.
It's interesting to me that there's this baseline, the minimum below which they just will not fall, and that definitely is a core. There was one kind of anomaly that you discussed in the Reagan years. There were some perceived Democratic voters who voted for Reagan, but they weren't true Democrats at the presidential level, anyway. Right.
Here's something interesting, I guess, I came across. I began to look at that, and in my estimation, I think we talk about Reagan Democrats, and there's no question that Reagan did very well in 84, and of course he won in 80. But the question was, were they true Democrats? And what I put forth is they weren't true Democrats. They had already left the quote-unquote Democratic electorate, if you will, and therefore thus the presidential level in 68 and 72. So they weren't actually Democrats that he was pulling from. He was pulling from those individuals that came back from that one time in 76. And it skews the result. It makes people feel that there was a dramatic shift over. But there really wasn't a dramatic shift over of Democratic voters. Those individuals at the presidential level weren't Democratic voters anymore. They were just, because of that anomaly, they were just voters for that one election. And thus, if you look at it, he actually pulled very, very little of, quote-unquote, you would say, Democratic voters in the 1980 election, in 84. And the reason for it is because the trend doesn't move, actually, at all. It's a straight line, regardless, even in 1980 and even 1984. If it would have fluctuated, then you could make a case that he pulled a great deal of the voters from the Democratic electorate over, but it doesn't. It's still a straight line.
You've said it a couple of times. I want to emphasize for clarity, because it's emphasized in the book very well, and that is, this is a presidential trend. People may vote Democratic for the president and vote otherwise in local elections, right?
That's exactly right. This anomaly exists at the presidential level. Now, I do think that on elections that coincide, let's say Senate elections or House elections that coincide with presidents, I have not looked at this, but I imagine that there's something if you go down to lower offices, there's much more swing voters back and forth at these lower levels, and there exists, swing voters back and forth in the presidential. And I looked at exit polls, and I show that it does exist.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that it is consistent. That swing back and forth is very consistent, and it's a smaller amount compared to the larger voting total.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you mentioned, and there's some good analysis in here of voting age population and the trends there. But one of the things you mentioned that I was a little surprised by is that if I'm born in a Democrat family, I'm more likely to stay Democrat. If I'm born in a Republican family, I'm more likely to be a Republican voter. Is that generally accurate?
Right. Exactly. There's some studies. They call it family socialization, and the normal family socialization could be anything, not just voting. It could be, for example, your religious affiliation.
Mm-hmm.
If you were Baptist, your kids be Baptist, and not to say that it doesn't break, but usually that's the tradition. Well, it turns out that same thing exists with voting. Mm-hmm. So if you were a Democrat, and your kids are more likely to be Democrats. You're Republican, your kids are more likely to be Republican. So this is how the trend was sustained over this 30-some-year period of time, because clearly it's not just the same people voting; it's actually new people coming on. But because of that, they actually were socialized, if you will, and voting the same way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm an outlier there. I'm an outcast in my family because my brother and my parents are the opposite party of mine. But the interesting the Democratic popular vote for president, how accurate your projections are during that trend time, and the 97% plus on this prediction scale.
Yes. I have in the book, where I have a cell sheet, if you will, in the book, a teaser that you could have predicted the 92, 96, and 2000 popular vote for the Democratic candidate. You could have predicted it in 1988, with a 99% accuracy. If you go back to 84, you could have predicted 88 through 2000 with a 97, as you said. And so it's extremely linear. It's extreme straight line. And that just shouldn't happen under normal circumstances. So clearly something was going on.
Mm-hmm. And the Republican and Independent are not as easily predictable during that time frame, right?
That's absolutely right. They exist in what I call the non-democratic electorate. So they are fighting for the same voters in essence. Now, again, the Republicans have their core voters, but they are really fighting for the same voters. So they're pulling votes away from each other, where, again, as the theory says, the Democrat candidate from 72 to 2000 is over there in its own election, basically by him or herself, in this case, himself. Right?
And this started with all of that, the turbulent 60s thing, especially, although there is that moment in 48 when Truman made it a little bit of a difference. But you suggest that Democratic electorate is still fractured, and there may be other issues that keep them apart from the non-Democratics. But I'm wondering if somewhere underlying that is still race. But of course, there's marriage equality, and I don't know what other issues one might cite from 2000 on.
Right, and that's it's amazing. I think you're right. I think there were these turbulent issues going on in the 60s, and then you had the Civil Rights Act and those issues that probably fractured the electorate. But that's not necessarily what kept the electorate fractured. What happens is we just substituted these wedge issues for one for another. Mm-hmm. And abortion, you can think about, like you said, marriage equality. You can think of maybe the tax issue, if you will. But we have these issues, immigration. We have these issues now that actually act as proxies for those issues that fractured, or was the impetus for fracturing back in the 60s. We're now just substituted. And so now we're in a situation, healthcare, that's another new issue now that continues to fracture the electorate. So we're just substituting different issues and keeping the electorate probably fractured. And when I trend ended in 2000, and so we don't have that linear straight line. It dipped up, and then it dipped down in 2012. But I show in the book that it's still probably fractured. There is something that occurred in 2012 that was interesting, but from my estimation, our electorate is still fractured, even though the linear trend stopped.
Yeah, I was about to ask you about that next. I'm glad you brought that up forward, because it is interesting that even though the linear trend has stopped, and I won't talk about regression analysis on the air because my students' eyes get glazed over in class when I talk about it. But it's very clear from your analysis that things can still be forecast very well, not only on the popular vote, but even on the Electoral College. And I wonder why more attention hasn't been paid to this trend prior to you. I mean, one of the things that I remember about the 2012 election is that I think the Mitt Romney supporters thought he was going to win to the very end.
Right.
They didn't read the right polls or something.
Right. You're right. You're right. You remember there was a group of polls that had him ahead,
mm-hmm.
And then you had other polls that didn't. And I think you're absolutely right. It is a situation of, our technology has moved us to the point that we can watch, to a certain extent, the news we want to watch.
Right.
And if we do that, then we're living in that world of watching that and believing those things. And you're absolutely right. I mean, this latest documentary on Mitt Romney showed that they truly believed they were going to win up to the end.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you have to do that to a certain extent. So I don't think that's that odd. But they did not realize that there was definitely a possibility that they could lose. Getting back to what you were saying, you're right. Because of this fracturing, it left the predictability of the percentage, the popular vote percentage, fairly accurate within a certain range. And it's not only accurate in many in the country, rather. It's also potentially accurate in states, where you can actually look at certain states and actually project. Now, of course, there are always exceptions and anomalies when you go down to the states, and I show as you can go down to even the county level, and I went down to a particular county that I actually live in, mm-hmm. and showed that the trend existed at the county level, and it will manifest itself. This predictability would manifest itself even down to the lower level. But as you go down to the lower level, other factors come involved and probably makes it a little less accurate down to that level.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting read and compelling evidence that you provide, answering what might be somebody's objections that you would anticipate regarding what you've established here, and you go through and you answer them very well. I think I was impressed with the battleground states, because I think more and more that the only state that presidents really have to win is Ohio, because everything else is set. But you talk about Florida, right. Florida, Virginia, that are other battleground states too, and also about the trends in minority vote as well. And it looks like if one were to project the 2016 race as to whether a Democrat or Republican would win the presidency, what would Tony Fairfax say?
Well, first let me say that back when this fracturing occurred, again, it left the Democratic electorate in essentially the core. And then you had the non-Democratic electorate on the other side. But the situation with the Democratic electorate was it's increasing at a faster rate than the non-Democratic electorate. Mm-hmm. And I have a couple of graphs that show that. It's to the point that we're approximately equal right now. Right at this point, I would say advantage. If we were playing tennis, I would say advantage Democrats a point. Mm-hmm. But as we move further each year, this Democratic electorate gets larger and larger, moving away from the non-Democratic electorate side, becoming much larger over a period of time than the non-Democratic electorate. So the advantage is definitely for the Democrats.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been talking with Tony Fairfax. The book is The Presidential Trend, The Remarkable Voting Predictability of the Office of President, includes the 2016 election analysis. I want to remind our listeners, if you don't catch us the 4 times we air every week, we're also on Facebook at Good Books Radio, and you can hear a rebroadcast there. Thanks for listening.